Greetings and welcome to another episode of the Love Queendom. This is a space of love and joy and peace and abundance and all the good things. And here at the Love Queendom, we talk about how to create your own reality. And on today's episode, I'm going to share with you all part one of my spiritual journey, how I got to where I'm at today. And in this episode, I want to talk about the early years of my life, starting from my early childhood, growing up Christian, becoming disillusioned with the church and Christianity, and sort of walking away from that, basically. So this is really just to give my listeners an understanding of where I'm coming from on my spiritual journey. And I know that many people can relate to this as well, because many people who listen to this podcast will likely come from a similar background. Even if you're not from the same religion, you may have had a similar experience. So I grew up in a Christian Nigerian household in Canada. But what I'll say is that I was lucky in the sense that my parents were not like super religious. I did grow up going to church every weekend, but my family, both of my parents grew up Catholic. So I was baptized in a Catholic church. I don't think I ever did my confirmation. My brother did, but I never did my confirmation. I went to Catholic schools my whole life. And at some point, we were going to a Catholic church every weekend. And then my mom's brother and his wife moved to Canada, and they started a church, and that became our family's church. So I started going to a Nigerian church. And if you know anything about African churches, West African churches, it's your typical evangelical West African church. So that was what I grew up in. And much of the culture around these types of churches has a lot to do, in my personal opinion, with the social dynamics in the church. So it's not so much focused on the actual growing of your spirituality, let's say. It has a lot to do with, you know, how you dress when you go to church and socializing with people. And for many people who go to these types of churches, I find that their entire social life is based on church. And when I became a teenager, I started attending the young adult fellowship and getting more involved in church in terms of attending events, going to church camp and stuff like that. And in many ways, church became my social circle. That was where I met a lot of people in my age range, started interacting with boys kind of romantically and stuff. So this is where it all started for me. So I met my first boyfriend in church, and I actually lost my virginity to him. And this is where I'll say the beginning of my church trauma came from, because obviously having your first romantic experience, your first intimate, emotionally intimate experience with someone, and then it going wrong is a very traumatic thing. And also because these events were tied to people that were involved in my church, I tied these experiences to church. Also because church, the concept of religion is that it's supposed to be a place of love, right? This is supposed to be a safe space for people mentally, emotionally, and spiritually to grow and feel safe. But that wasn't the case for me. I think the more I got into church, the deeper I got into it, the more I started to see through the illusion of this whole positive place that was safe. And I could see that many of the people there were, I don't want to say not good people, because I don't really believe that. I just think these people were just people who had their own selfish needs, their own selfish desires. They were operating from their ego, basically, completely unaware of themselves. And we were all deluding ourselves into thinking that we were good just because we went to church. And when a lot of things fell out with me and my first boyfriend, there was cheating involved with other women who were in the church. It was just, that was when it became too much for me and I had to walk away from it. So I left that church and I tried going to another church. That didn't really work for me. I didn't really feel anything. And as I've gone deeper and deeper on my spiritual journey, particularly where I'm at right now, I understand now the extreme significance and importance of feeling, because actually our feelings and our emotions have a lot to do with reality creation. So going to another church, it not really resonating with me, not really feeling anything from it, trying to connect on my own, sort of, let's say, with God, walking away, reading the Bible on my own, trying to have my own personal relationship with Jesus Christ and all that kind of stuff. The whole thing just felt phony for me. I just felt like I was trying to do this performative stuff that you're supposed to do as a Christian, but it never really did anything for me in terms of making my life better, making me feel better. I just felt like there were all of these things that you were supposed to do as a good Christian. And the whole idea is that if you do all these things and you be a good Christian, your life will be good and you'll get into heaven. And there was just all this fear around not aligning with these things because of the fear of condemnation, right? This is so much of what drives religion, and what keeps people attached to it is the fear. These are actually fear-based ideologies disguised as love-based ideologies and a love-based spiritual practice, which they unfortunately are not. And one disclaimer that I will give here, or I'm not really too sure if it's a disclaimer, but one thing I will say is that there is a difference fundamentally between the teachings of Jesus Christ and the religion of Christianity. So that's one thing that I'm going to say here, because I'll do a separate video on what are the real teachings of Jesus Christ. There are other videos on YouTube, many videos on YouTube actually, made by other people who talk about this. And when you actually begin to step out of religion and really understand from an agnostic spiritual perspective what Jesus was actually trying to teach, you'll understand that it's not really about adhering to rules and doctrines and quote and unquote following him. It's really a journey of going inside of yourself, which is what I practice, becoming spiritually sovereign and learning how to control the spiritual mechanisms that we have within us in order to create our own reality. Another part of my spiritual journey, part one, from let's say ages when I was born until age 20, was that around the time I was maybe 9 or 10 years old, my mom had gotten sick. She fell ill with some sort of scalp condition. And during that time, doctors could not diagnose her with anything. And she was suffering a lot from basically what was like boils on her scalp. And it affected her a lot. And it ended up affecting my family a lot as well. And in her desperation to find a solution to her illness, she started seeking religious intervention. And I think this is another part of my initial spiritual journey where I could see a lot of the toxicity involving the dynamics of churchgoers and their pastors and the power dynamics at play when people are desperate and they're looking outside of themselves for solutions to their problems. So my mom ended up coming into contact with a pastor who she was introduced to by a family friend. And the pastor essentially took advantage of my mom. He could see that she was incredibly gullible and desperate. my mom is also very trusting and kind-hearted, and he took advantage of that because, again, whether you are supposed to be a pastor is supposed to be a man who moves from his heart and moves with love. These organizations, these religions are not really built or based on that. These are ego-based structures. So what you're going to get is people operating from their ego, which is a survivalist way of being. And part of that survival mode is taking advantage of other people for your benefit. So this is what happened. And my mom ended up basically being like a financial slave to this pastor whom she had put a lot of her trust into. She became extremely close with this person, and it also destroyed her marriage with my father, which wasn't a good marriage anyways. But either way, this was the catalyst for their divorce because her involvement in his ministry was just too much for my family to handle. She was no longer mentally or emotionally present with our family. She put so much of herself into serving and dedicating herself to him and his ministry because eventually when she became cured of her scalp ailment, she attributed her cure to him and decided that she was going to fully commit to his ministry and dedicate her life to him. So that went on for well over 10 years of my life. And that caused a lot of trauma as well for myself, my siblings, my father as well too, because we essentially lost the life that we were used to living. Everything fell apart when she became involved with this person. So this also added to my church trauma and my disillusionment because not only was I experiencing things in the church, dynamics, toxic social dynamics with people in church, I was also seeing toxic dynamics between pastors and their congregants, particularly in this dynamic with my mom and her pastor. And I could see that too, even in my church, how these many pastors feel a level of authority and entitlement over their congregation and the members of their church. And there is a level of servitude that many of these people engage in with their pastors. So this all contributed to my level of disillusionment with church, layers of church trauma, and eventually at some point, all of my trying to stay aligned with the church, stay aligned with Christianity wasn't really working for me. But I will also say that because of the fear-based nature of religion, I wasn't ready to fully walk away from it just yet. So I walked away from church, but I hadn't yet walked away from the religion of Christianity. And all of these things transpired, I would say, from my early years growing up Catholic. That was maybe when I was from when I was born until when I was about 6 or 7 years old. And then I started going to an evangelical church from when I was about 7 or 8 until I was maybe in my early 20s, let's say age 19, 20. I would say that's around when things sort of hit a peak for me where I became disillusioned with church and I walked away from church. And at that point, I said, okay, I'm still a Christian. I still believe in God. I still have a relationship with God through Jesus Christ, but I'm no longer going to be participating in church because it was just too toxic for me. I think the social dynamics that were going on in church was too toxic for me. When I tried going to other churches, I didn't really feel an emotional connection with any of the people there. And from speaking with my other friends who had started going to other churches, particularly churches that are predominantly Caucasian, what I would find is that as you get deeper into these churches as well, you kind of find the same dynamics. So either way, what you're experiencing in these organizations is just human beings who are actually living from a low level of conscious awareness, trying to be spiritual, trying to align themselves with what they're taught from these religious ideologies, but they don't really have an awareness of their fullness of themselves. So they're just living from their egos, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with them. But again, these dynamics, create these energies rather, and this perception that these people are living from and operating from creates a lot of toxic dynamics. And I talk about this a lot when we talk about ego versus heart, 3D versus 5D, etc. People who are adhering to religion, there's many of them are still living from a 3D perspective. They haven't really come into the full understanding and awareness of themselves as a spiritual being, having a human experience, understanding their spiritual sovereignty, and really learning how to control the spiritual mechanisms present within themselves in order to control their own reality. And it's only once you become aware of these things that you can really step out of religion fully and step into spiritual sovereignty. But I'm going to end things here. This is going to be part 1 of... So far, I have 5 parts planned for this series about my spiritual journey. So stay tuned for the next episode, where I will be talking about my dabblings into the law of attraction, when I finally decided to walk away from Christianity as well. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you guys in the next episode.